Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, my co-host and husband. How are you doing today, Omar?
I'm doing great. We're recording a little earlier than normal, and I'm excited. I'm a morning person, I would say. How are you doing?
I'll tell the listeners too. I was just telling Omar before this. I was like, all right, we're going to keep this episode a little bit shorter today because I'm getting some blood work done, some labs drawn a little bit later this morning. And I'll tell you what, I am normally I schedule if I'm going to get my labs done, which I get blood work done a few times a year because I like to stay on top of, looking at everything. And so when I'm scheduling out blood work, I will, schedule it weeks in advance so I can make sure I get the earliest appointment, 7 a.m. or as soon as they open so I can get it done, not have to worry about the fasting aspect of it because your girl likes to eat when she wakes up. She likes to have her coffee in the morning. And, we had a hurricane that came through last week. And, of course, this was nothing to complain about of oh, gosh, my blood work had to get rescheduled. But just saying that's why my blood work had to be rescheduled. And with doing a last-minute reschedule, the earliest appointment they had available was 10:30 in the morning. So not ideal for someone who likes to have her food and coffee in the morning.
Yep. We're on the struggle bus this morning.
You know what? You guys can call me out because especially if you've been listening for a long time, there's been periods of time where I was completely coffee free. And now I'm currently I have 1 cup of coffee a day and I love my coffee.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to give it up right now.
I'm still of the belief that caffeine doesn't do anything to me. So I'm whatever. It really doesn't, but.
He's like, caffeine doesn't do anything to me. And then every day he's like, oh, I really want my coffee. I really need my coffee.
It tastes good. I do it for the taste, not because of what it does. But
speaking of getting the labs done and kind of getting everything checked out, I something I wanted to bring to the podcast today is I feel like a lot of people are starting to kind of wonder and ask why is everybody seeming to talk about hormone imbalances these days? Have you noticed that on social media? And it might just be kind of the circle that we're in as well, being more in the fitness space. But it seems like everybody is suddenly going from whether they were more fitness coach or nutrition coach or, fat loss, macros, it seems like suddenly everybody is heading in the direction of talking about hormones.
Well, I mean, you have more experience in it than I do, but would it be fair to say that do you think this is probably the result of all of the fitness industry and all of the quick fixes and fad diets and all those things that are now coming to fruition? And now people are like, oh, well, what used to work 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was, in my 30s or my 40s, whatever, is no longer working. And now I feel like crap. I'm having all these symptoms and they're like, well, I don't know what else to do. You go to a doctor, the doctor's like, oh, everything's fine. And then they're like, well, is this just what I'm supposed to look or be, feel like or look like or whatever? And I think that's part of the frustration that comes along with it,
100%. Yeah. I mean, so when I think back to when I first started talking about hormone health a little bit more back a few years ago now. And at that point in time, it seemed almost weird to talk about. Nobody was really talking about it then. And I almost didn't like talking about it too much. I kept it more of talking about it within the one-on-one coaching, and I would bring it to the podcast here and there and things like that. But I didn't talk about it too much on social media because it almost seemed a little bit taboo at the time. It wasn't normal and regular to talk about those things. But now, so many women, honestly, I feel like almost every woman who comes to us looking for help on some level is also expressing that she thinks there's something going on with her hormones or she knows there's something going on with her hormone health. Yeah. And I think women are just waking up and realizing now that 80% of women is actually, this is a real statistic, you can look this up, 80% of women are estimated to have an underlying hormone imbalance right now, which is wild. And it makes sense also why we are in this kind of epidemic of women being unable to lose weight. And like you were saying, the diet industry, the diet culture that, many of us have even grown up in, it's still so dominant, and it's just a multi-billion-dollar industry because women keep going back to it because it's actually not working long-term. And we're realizing that our hormone imbalances are not going to be fixed by diets. We're not going to be able to lose weight by basic diets anymore when we have these underlying hormone imbalances, and they're not going to be fixed by, medications that doctors are putting us on. And women are waking up and realizing that they want to feel better. They want to know better. They want to understand their bodies more. And that's where I think that's why a lot of women are seeking out more information around hormone health.
And another thing that I'll add, because we get a lot of this just in, consult calls and messages and stuff that we receive. But, I think a lot of women are of the belief, of the mindset that, well, I just need to work out more, or I just need to be more consistent. I need to stop being so lazy. I need to be more disciplined and dialed in, right? And while I do very much think that it is part of, what gets you results to a certain extent, you also have to kind of sit back and be like, well, if I've already tried this and I've been consistent and I can't keep up, is it me or is it the process that I'm trying to take to get me there, right? And I think that's what a lot of people forget. They're just like, well, I just need to keep doing it. And I literally tell people, I'm like, what's the definition of insanity? It's like doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe that's the problem, right? But again, that's something that I see so often, that people are just of the belief that if I just stick to it longer, if I just, can suck it up for the next 3 months, then afterwards, then I'll be fine. And I'm like, well, if it's not the right approach, it doesn't matter how long you stick to it. It's just never going to work.
Yeah. I'm going to start keeping a list of Omarisms, because I feel like
I like that.
The definition of insanity, that's like one of your go-to lines, where I feel like that's probably shows up on the podcast every, I don't know, whoever is consistently listening to the episodes and probably has picked up on that. Like, we got to start a list of Omarisms.
Do it.
Yeah, but no, I mean, more and more women are dealing with things like, irregular cycles, a little bit more PMS getting more and more debilitating. They're dealing with a lot of like early onset menopause. It's wild. We're seeing so many women in their early 30s, late 30s, really starting to show symptoms of menopause, which is crazy. We're seeing more and more hypothyroidism cases, more and more Hashimoto's along with that, more and more PCOS. Like, there's so much that's becoming so prevalent now. And so why is this happening? Well, that's what I want to really cover for you in this episode, so that you can be empowered with that information. So number one, and this is really, in my opinion, these are, in my opinion, the reasons why we're seeing more and more hormone imbalances. And number one is higher stress across the board. I think we are living in a culture where stress is like normalized. It's almost like you wear the badge of honor of like, I'm busier than you are. And like, busy is that badge of honor of, oh, I'm so busy. I'm so stressed. I'm so, all these things. And like, we normalize it. It really takes up a lot of our conversations with friends and family. And, there's a lot of it in terms of, we have work, finances, politics. Of course, like, this time of year is very stressful. There's a lot of things happening just across the world that are very stressful, undeniably. And so there's higher stress levels across the board. And I think as a culture, we're not really taught really effective ways to manage our stress growing up. And so a lot of women are kind of left in this fight or flight response and really not knowing what to do about it, besides, get on like a anxiety medication and things like that, which is absolutely, a great solution for a lot of women, but it's not always addressing, of course, like the root cause of why we're starting to get to those points of anxiety.
Do you think another aspect of it too, like just being connected 24/7 on like social media, and even with it's like work or just personal situation where you're like, oh my gosh, this person's doing this, so I need to keep up, or this person's, whatever kind of thing,
100%. I have that on my list as well. I think we are just more lonely and isolated as a culture than ever before. Like, this is a very new thing that we're in when you think about it, of like, we're part of like the generation that actually grew up, without social media. Nowadays, kids don't even know what that's like.
Yeah.
And think of these next generations of women and how their hormones are going to be affected by the fact that we are using social media instead of real connection. And that does have severe effects on our health.
Well, have you ever seen even just, there was a reel that I saw the other day, but it's like the way that like the human body is evolving and adapting to like the way we look down on our phone. And yeah, exactly. You get like all the humps in your leg and stuff. Yeah, exactly. It's just really, really bizarre.
Yeah, it's kind of scary as well. But, another thing on my list, societal expectations on women. I think there's a big, we're in a weird time where women are really doing it all. You have women who are balancing there's a lot of women more and more that are like becoming the sole providers in their household, or just becoming the main provider in their household. There's a lot of women who are single moms and working full-time jobs. There's a lot of women who have families and are kind of expected in maybe their relationship or in their communities to kind of be more of like the traditional woman, more of the traditional mom, while also these same women have have career aspirations and are doing a lot within their career. Like there's just this very much this, hustle culture, kind of keeping up with the Joneses, like stress on women coming from societal expectations. No thoughts on that one?
No, I mean, I agree. I was thinking, there's like that girl boss movement, and I do think it's awesome, and I do very much support it. But you're right. I hate to say it like this, and this might be another Omarism, but, with women having additional hormones and menstrual cycles, it's a lot to put on somebody. And so, of course, your body is impacted. Of course, all these things are impacted, where I think guys can very much get away with something like that because we're a little bit more resilient in that sense,
Yeah, like on a physiological level, men are a little bit more resilient on that hormonal standpoint.
I'm kidding. Yeah. I'm kidding. This is where I get canceled.
This is cancel Omar. Let's start that movement. No, I don't want to do this podcast on my own, please. Number 4 on my list, and we're kind of jumping around here a little bit as well, is we talked about using social media instead of real connection, kind of being more lonely as a culture. But moving through my list here, also let's talk about the food aspect of things. What is often considered like our nutrient dense whole foods is actually less nutrient dense today than it was in previous years due to poor soil quality, poor just like overall the food industry is not in a great spot with making sure that our nutrient dense foods are still nutrient dense. So like comparing an apple today to an apple many decades ago, it is very, very different in the nutrient quality within that. And that's honestly very sad because healthy food is also more expensive nowadays and it's harder to come by for a lot of people. And so the fact are it's harder to acquire healthy food.
And even think of it as the convenience factor, right? Mm-hmm. So you were saying the higher stress, the societal expectations, women are out and about taking care of kids, jobs and everything. What's easier, to go home and cook like something from scratch or to pick up something and just be able to throw it in the microwave? Of course, the microwave is, right? So I think that's the other aspect of it too. And then you have things like, how many times when you and I have been doing the flush, we've looked at products and we're like, oh, maybe we can have this as part of the flush. And then you look at the ingredients list and you're like, never mind. Look at all the gum this and acid this or whatever, right? It's so hard to find them. We were just talking yesterday, like that company Siete chips, which by the way, if you guys don't know, they're now being bought up by Pepsi. And so, the other concern there is, in a couple of weeks, months, whatever, look at the ingredients list. I'm sure that's going to change. And that's the hard aspect of it, that you're like, well, what do I even eat? What do I even look for nowadays? So it's just so crazy.
All the big food companies that have so much control over things. Like I heard Max Lugavere had said something recently where he was like, how did he phrase it? He said, if there is a health food section in a store, what does that make the rest of the food in that store? Because it's the reality of like if you have this small section that's considered your healthy food section, then it's like, what else is everything else? Is it not actually food at that point in time? And I don't say this by any means to fearmonger. Like we are all for balance here. Our clients, if you're listening to this, that like we talk about that hugely. If there are no foods off limits and we want to have balance, but we also want to make sure that we are aware and making intentional food choices, knowing the potential impacts of having a more standard American diet, which is predominantly highly processed foods, mainly highly processed foods, and you're not getting enough servings of these more nutrient dense foods. And then now with this point that we're making here, that nutrient dense foods are not as nutrient dense as they once were. It's kind of a scary thought, essentially. But along the same lines, going down my list, also this just in our current culture, we do have higher intakes of processed, poor quality food. And again, it's not to say that those foods are bad. There's no such thing as good and bad foods. Foods can have different purposes and different value. It's more of like the things that we do with foods of like overconsumption of foods that are highly processed that can have bad effects on the body. It doesn't necessarily mean that those foods are inherently bad. So when we're having a lot of those foods, that's where we can absolutely find that we are developing hormone imbalances. It does have an impact on our gut and our liver function, which is going to impact our ability to keep our hormones balanced at the end of the day. So 100%, like we of course can't gloss over the fact that food is a huge aspect of where we're at right now with this higher level of hormone imbalances. Along the same lines of food, going down my list here, we also, as a culture, we've been raised more in like what I would call diet culture. Talked about this a little bit earlier, but women nowadays, like talking to so many women who come to us for asking for help around these types of things, I hear a really common sentiment along the lines of, I was in kind of middle school or high school when I first started feeling really self-conscious of my body. I first maybe received comments around my body from other people. I first was introduced to the idea of diets, and that's when I first started dieting. And it's really crazy to think of like at such a young age, we were introduced to diets. And that's me. I was there. I remember my first time when I was like walking through a grocery store, and my mom, and she's amazing, God bless her, but she also like had, this was very much when diet culture was becoming huge, and so she thought she was doing the best she could of like trying to build awareness around different things. But she had kind of pointed out that like I'm eating a lot of calories, and had like we had walked through the grocery stores. I asked her, I was like, well, how many calories should I be eating? And so she was like showing me food labels, and she's like, you just want this number, the calorie number, to be as low as possible. And I remember kind of thinking of like, that was when things kind of clicked in for me of like, oh, I just need to eat low calories as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And then I remember like getting I was doing like the Special K diet, getting the little
cereal.
special, when they had like, which, oh my God, talk about like genius marketing campaigns for them that were just terrible for us. But taking a cereal brand and saying that this is going to be your diet is just to eat that cereal, and the product spin-offs of that, of you can have the Special K cereal bar as your snack.
Oh, I remember those. The yogurt that was out there too.
Yeah,
remember
exactly.
That?
You can have, like I think it was like a little yogurt drink, and it was just like their own like little diet.
Yeah.
And I remember like I would have the Special K bars as my little snack at school, and I remember at that school that they would also like sell these fresh baked cookies, and I remember they always looked so good. Like, if you know me, I am a cookieaholic, like have been that way since day one. So yes, back then I was like very much, I would see the cookies come out of the oven looking so good, and like, oh, those look so delicious. And I remember I would feel like kind of resentful of other students, other kids that were like going to, buy a cookie, and we're eating their cookie, and I would get out my Special K bar and be like, no, I'm on my diet. And it's like, that's so crazy. I was a child. And it's just, that's what has happened for a lot of us women, is we were raised in diet culture. So we spent many years of like, especially very formative years from our preteens, teens, 20s, whenever it was, maybe you started dieting, it probably was one of those kind of decades. And through that time, you were under eating. You were not giving your body sufficient nourishment, probably not nutrient dense foods, and you probably were not giving your body everything it needed. So you were setting your body up to have issues with hormones. So, I mean, it's wild to think about that. And that's not even getting into like the over-exercising aspect of diet culture too.
I was just going to say, remember you've always shared with me how like you would, or your mom would drop you off at Orange Theory, and you'd be like, oh my gosh. And you were hanging out with your girlfriends and all that stuff.
I remember back like when I was, a kid, I did a lot of different things, from like going to Orange Theory classes with my friends. It's like a social thing. And again, that's not bad by any means, but like I was doing a lot there for a period of time. I was doing way too much for my body. And I know this for a lot of women, especially if you maybe grew up in sports, you might have been doing like a lot of different sports activities. And if you were doing that alongside doing different diets, not eating enough, maybe just not even having enough education around nutrition, you might not have been giving your body enough. You might have been overstressing your body. So definitely a huge problem as well. And then we can get into, like the word I know people don't love, and I don't necessarily like to throw this word around either, but toxins. Endocrine disruptors, essentially, is really what we're talking about here. So there are components in everything from food to beauty products to cleaning products to a lot of different things that we're exposed to in everyday life that do contain chemicals and toxins that are what you would call endocrine disruptors, which means that they are essentially like they can, potentially mimic other hormones in the body. So like there's such a thing as xenoestrogens, which is essentially when these different like chemicals can mimic estrogen in the body, and it can produce estrogen dominance. So there's a lot of different ways that it can throw off your hormones, your endocrine system. So that's a huge aspect of things. And it's not something that I think people have like really still fully like woken up to, you could say. Like I'll admit myself, like I still am not fantastic with this. There's a lot of beauty products I use that are not on like the clean list, and I just kind of am like, yeah, it's okay, like whatever. But as long as you're consistently, I think, working on doing some things over the course of time, and that's what I've worked on doing kind of year over year, is slowly improve different products that I'm using. I think that's kind of like the best thing we can do, really, and not get, crazy about these kinds of things, because you could absolutely drive yourself crazy trying to cut out all of the things. But it's really about lowering your overall exposure. And then, kind of last couple points here. Birth control. This is one we've talked about on the podcast periodically as well. Like at the end of the day, birth control is a great solution for a lot of women, but it also is something we have to be aware of the fact that we really don't have a lot of very long-term research on birth control. Think of like the very first birth control pill was introduced in 1960.
Was it really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
So and that was the very first iteration. Think of like all the different forms of birth control that have been introduced since then. That was just the very basic version of the pill. Now you have various types of pills. You have IUDs, you have Nexplanon, like you have so many different types of birth control that have been introduced over the decades. And these are, of course, like there is research done on them, but that's not long-term research. We're not seeing yet what are the impacts of being on this through all of your reproductive years. Because if let's say you were like one of the people to get on it first thing when it first came out in 1960, maybe you were in like your early teen years, let's say you were 15, that was 64 years ago now?
Yeah, I'm trying to do the math and see if that would make
sense. Like that was like 64 years ago. Add, if you were 15 years old, you were about 80 or so now. So like that's those very first people that might have been on birth control would be now about 80 years old. Mm-hmm. We might now just be starting to see the very long-term effects of like your lifespan having been on birth control for a period of time. And it's very sad, but there is a lot of research showing how birth control does impact a lot of very serious health issues and how it is starting to show indications with different types of things. Of course, it varies based on type of birth control. There's a lot to go into there, but it is absolutely something that is impacting women's hormones undeniably. And then the last thing on my list, just medications in general. There's so many medications. We're a very medicated society nowadays. And the reality is, like we've talked about, everything from like being exposed to toxins and endocrine disruptors in food and beauty products and all the things. Now imagine like you're being exposed to that. You're not getting enough nutrient-dense food. Now you're on a medication. Now you're also on birth control. It's overall in totality. It's probably not just one of those things that's going to be like the overall, like that's why you've developed hormone imbalances. But when we add all of these things together, you're kind of like filling up a bucket of your body's ability to handle all of this. Yeah. And eventually one of those is going to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and it's going to cause that bucket to overflow. And that's where suddenly you have hormone imbalances. So it's all like, I don't want this episode by any means to be just like something that's going to cause people to now put themselves in a victim mindset and feel like, oh my gosh, there's no hope for us as women. We're doomed. Like there's no hope for me. I might as well just say screw it and just do nothing. And because I'm just going to always have hormone imbalances, like that is not at all the case. I can tell you that so many of the women that we've worked with have not had to make crazy drastic changes in order to get their hormones back in balance. But it's about catching it before it gets too bad. When you're in a place where your hormones are in a really bad spot, whereas like, I've been in the past, we've had clients that have been in that spot, that's when we do have to get more like the more extreme issues, the more kind of like extreme the solutions have to be. So if you don't want to be in that path of having to go extreme with this type of stuff, then really take care of this stuff now. And that's why I wanted to put this episode out there, is to create awareness around how, whether or not you're currently experiencing symptoms of hormone imbalances or whether or not you suspect there's anything going on with your hormones, it is good for you to create awareness around what might be happening in your body, but in our bodies as women, due to kind of all these things we talked about here. And knowledge is power, and you have the power to change your circumstance here. You have the opportunity to change your body's hormone health by just looking at, all the things we talked about here and truly thinking, okay, how can I maybe reduce some of these types of things that are potentially causing my hormones to go out of balance? How can I kind of work on some of these just a little bit more?
Where would you even start, would you say? Like, where would you recommend? Because somebody, because probably listening to this and they're like, well, I am stressed. And, I was raised in a household where like diet culture was a thing, and I've done that through my 20s. Like, where do I even begin, Vanessa? Like, where would you say?
I think it's really going to be individual. It's going to be like, what are the things that stick out to you the most? Because you're going to know. There's probably like one of these I was talking through that you're like, oh, yep, I feel called out. Like, that is me. You kind of feel that like maybe sinking feeling in your gut a little bit. That's probably a sign that maybe that's something that we want to focus on first. So if that is like, you're like, yeah, I know my stress is really bad, I know that's an issue, then maybe that's where we need to start. And that might mean, that could mean just like working on introducing really small ways to kind of manage stress, to kind of bring your nervous system down, to kind of help balance out some of that high stress in your life. That might mean having like hard conversations with people in your life, looking for more support, seeing how you can kind of navigate that stuff. But overall, managing your nutrition, your exercise, your mindset, your lifestyle habits, like all of that is going to encompass kind of managing all those things that we talked about. And those are all the things that we work on with our clients, of course. Those are the things that will improve your body's resilience drastically. And if your body is more resilient, we can reverse or prevent these hormone imbalances from happening. So, if you do want to kind of also get some more specific ways to get started with this stuff, I did put together a complete hormone healing blueprint guide. I actually introduced this on social media recently, and I am like slammed right now with the amount of people that have been asking for this guide.
It went crazy. It was nuts.
Yeah. It's wild. So, I'm glad that you guys are all really enjoying this, and it's fantastic to hear that. So I wanted to offer that up to our podcast listeners who may not be, on social media as much as well, or may just not have seen kind of my posts about it. So if you do want this guide, because it does contain kind of everything you need to know, it contains the most common kind of hormone imbalances that I see and symptoms of those. It contains a full kind of health assessment questionnaire that you can use to assess different systems of your body to kind of identify what the root cause might be. It gives you specific tips with your nutrition, your fitness. It gives you a full workout program you can follow. It kind of gives you everything that you need there. If you want that, go ahead and just jump over to Instagram, shoot me a message. So I am at Vanessa G Fitness on Instagram. Go ahead and shoot me a message saying blueprint, and I will make sure I get that sent over to you as soon as I can.
And if they're not on Instagram, I'm assuming they can do the same on Facebook too,
yep,
right?
Absolutely. Instagram or Facebook is the best way to reach me there. Thank you so much for listening, you guys. If you can, do me a favor, share this with somebody else. Spread the word to other women who need to understand what is happening in their bodies so that they can take action and feel empowered to do what they need to do to take control of their hormone health. So make sure you hit subscribe if you're not already. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Bye, everybody.